Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Colonel Pat Williams, who is the commander of the 557th Weather Wing out of Offutt Air Base in Omaha, Nebraska. Pat Williams, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
The conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Pat, will connect weather with influence, especially in a military context. But before we get into these topics, could you give our audience a little more background about your career? And I'd also like to get your assessment of our current strategic landscape.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an airman. So I'm in the Air Force, but I was trained as a meteorologist in the Air Force. So my career has taken me all over the place. I started off doing what we call aviation weather, takeoff weather, landing weather, en route weather for aircraft mostly. And then I started transitioning into space weather, working for NORAD initially over at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. And then I got stationed over to Vandenberg Air Force Base, where I transitioned more primarily into space weather. And we can get into that a little bit later. And that's where we really look at how does space weather affect communications mostly and satellite operations. So it's in association with the space at that time. From there, 9/11 kicked off and I said, hey, I got to get in this fight. So I transitioned into what we call Army support weather. And I spent about well, now it's not quite a full quarter, but almost a quarter of my career with the Army. All my deployments have been with the Army. The Air Force provides weather support to the Army because the Army does not have any weather forecasters of their own. So the Air Force provides that service to the Army. So I did that piece at Fort Hood, starting from Fort Hood for a while. And then pretty much bounced back and forth all over the place and moved through different staffing positions, deployed a few times. I was a deployed squadron commander doing weather support out there for the Army as well in Afghanistan. Prior to that, in 2003, I was deployed to Tikrit, Iraq with the Army as well. And then had a couple tours at the Pentagon doing policy and money and those things. And I was gracious enough to be given a group command here at Offutt, and then fleet up again, gracious enough to be given a wing. And now I'm a wing commander here at Offutt Air Force Base. As far as the strategic landscape, yeah, I tell you, it's not hard to see what's going on right now in the world, especially with Ukraine. And I think from a strategic perspective, you look across the world today, and it seems like the U.S. kind of took a different direction. And for a couple of years now, we've been taking a different direction of, do we really need a military? Do we really need a nuclear force? Do we really need that big of a conventional force? Do we really need information operations or information warfare at all? And let's kind of, we're all kind of at peacetime. And then Putin pretty much showed that that's not necessarily the case, and that we really do need a strong, robust military, and we just don't have the resources or the authorities necessary to hold bad actors at bay. That's not to say that we're forgetting China and that China should be ignored. China's still our pacing threat, but we're keeping an eye on them as well. But I think what's going on in the Ukraine today is just showing us that what we're doing in the DoD is vitally important, and we should not wither away on the vine, and we should actually be a lot more robust, because you never know when we're going to be called. And when we are called, we should be ready. And we owe it to our airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, and Guardians. We owe it to them and their families to make sure that they are ready, so that they don't get put in a bad spot like we've seen happen over in Ukraine and their military. So I think we owe it to the American people to make sure that our sons and daughters that we send to the DoD have the best available to us. So that's what I would say from the strategic landscape.
Great, thanks. So we'll have a link to your unit's website in the show notes so that people can go and check it out for themselves. As I was making some notes for this discussion, I was absolutely blown away with the scope of responsibilities that you and your airmen and civilians are tackling here. Do you think you could give a quick 101 of the capabilities of the 557th Air Wing?
Yeah, so we do a lot of things. So we are the Air Force's only weather wing, which is pretty cool. So we get the distinction of saying, hey, we're the best of this and the best of that, also because we're the only weather wing in the Air Force, which is pretty cool.
Hey, take it when you can. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
If we look at things from a bigger picture perspective, from a deterrence perspective, as an example, there are three different types of deterrence. There's strategic deterrence, and for strategic deterrence, we typically think nuclear. And we definitely have a role in that when we talk about STRATCOM and some of the other combatant commands. We play a role in that. When we talk about conventional deterrence, and I would look at it as an air superiority or ground scheme of maneuver or sea scheme of maneuver, we definitely play a role in that. Whether it's generate missions in the air, generate missions on the ground, partner with our Navy counterparts and generate missions in the sea so that we can have that superiority on air, land, and sea, and even in space. We have a role when it comes to that. We also now find that we have a role in what we call integrated deterrence, which is more the information dominance role or the information warfare role. And that's where this wing really comes into play. We've started it back in October of 19 when we fell under 16th Air Force, the Information Warfare Wing, or NAF rather, a numbered Air Force. And that's where we really started shifting our focus in on that. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a minute. But we have just under 1,500 airmen and civilians worldwide. I have them on 3 different continents, 18 dispersed locations around the world that contribute to the fight in one way, shape, or another, to get after the NDS, really. And so we've divided them into different groupings and settings, where each squadron, we have 12 squadrons and we have 2 groups. So squadrons nest under a group, nest under a wing. And so we have 12 squadrons, and each squadron has very specific and unique mission sets that we use to converge together with our intel and cyber partners and our operations partners to really exploit that nexus where the 4 of us meet together. So we truly believe that weather drives behavior, cyber enables that behavior, and intel interprets that behavior. And we find ourselves in the nexus right in the middle there to really predict and influence behavior. And that's really where our mission really comes into play. So our mission leading into that is we predict and influence behavior by applying science to mission. And so that's where we really get after it.
Wow. So you mentioned a moment ago that was it in 2019 when the 557th Wing came under the 16th Air Force? Is that about right?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about that process? You might not have been the commander then, but best why did the Air Force choose to do that, and just talk a little bit about that transformation?
Absolutely. So I was a group commander at the time here in this wing. Before, we were under 12th Air Force at the time, and our primary mission then was mostly resource protection and mission generation. That was our primary mission at that time. When we fell under 16th Air Force, 16th Air Force was just coming online. The President, the Secretary of Defense, and the DoD at large was looking across the forces and said, hey, we really don't have an ability to counter China and Russia's influence in the gray zone. And so as you take a big step back and look at how Russia and China and really all of the adversaries in the national defense strategy were quote unquote attacking us, it really wasn't force on force, and it wasn't nuclear weapon against nuclear weapon. It was that gray zone and the information dominance spectrum, so to speak. They were influencing our allies, they were influencing our economy, they were influencing our elections, they were influencing you name it, and that's how they were influencing us. And the DoD really did not have a mechanism at the time to counter that. And so 16th Air Force was born within the Air Force. I'm sure the other services did something similar. I'm just not familiar with their work. But within the Air Force, 16th Air Force was stood up. And as they were forming 16th Air Force and trying to figure out what it was going to do, they looked across the board and they said, hey, we have to reorganize everybody. Where do we think the 567th Weather Wing would fit in the most? And after some discussions, the predecessor who I replaced started making some discussions with those guys. Said, we really have a play in the information dominance role because we can certainly predict and influence a lot of behavior. And so that's where we started to focus our attention. And then they kind of shifted us under 16th Air Force. At that time, General Hawk, and he's still the commander right now, he put us to the test, so to speak. The combatant commanders would come in and they would present problems. Hey, here's a wicked problem I want you to solve. And then General Hawk would pass those out to his wing commanders and his wings and say, hey, solve this problem. What do you guys think? And we'd put our collective heads together and we'd start solving problems. And I think he globbed on to the unique perspective that we brought to the table because we're the only one of our kind, and liked what he saw. And so we got integrated fairly quickly. And ever since then, we've never looked back. We've just been going full throttle.
So the Space Force just stood up recently as well. Is your wing still the nexus of space weather related analysis and operational engagement?
Yes, we are. So we're still fully immersed in the space weather field. We've shifted our focus a little bit. So we've shifted our focus from space weather, space physics, geeky speak, so to speak, and we shifted it into operational focus. So we shifted from tradecraft, space physics, and into operations. So how does space weather affect military operations? And what we found was, for the most part, it definitely affects it in electromagnetic spectrum zone. And that's where we're really kind of focusing our attention. We do have some niche areas where we still provide capability to the Space Force. So space weather can increase drag on satellites. It can cause single event upsets. It can cause all sorts of havoc on the space satellite, which they call the bus, and the sensors on board. So a satellite has two parts, the actual bus or the satellite itself that floats through the sky, and the sensors on board it, which is why they sent the satellite up to begin with, which could be, communications, it could be for your TV, it could be anything really. And so there's two parts to every satellite. And so space weather affects both parts differently, but it affects both parts. It affects manned flight as well up in space. And so we provide capabilities and we provide warnings and stuff to our space flyers as well. But where we're really focusing on from a DoD perspective and a mission perspective is the electromagnetic spectrum. And in that sense, we are able to develop a roadmap of sorts to say, hey, at these Latin longs, in these specific zones of the globe, during these specific times, these specific frequencies may not be usable for various reasons, and it's mostly space weather related reasons. Terrestrial weather is part of that too. If I have a fairly significant thunderstorm between the satellite and the ground receiver, you're going to have disruptions there as well. So we put all that together and we create this roadmap, so to speak, to create some sort of freedom of maneuver for our own forces on where the electromagnetic spectrum may be usable and may not be usable. That works on the red side as well. And we partner with other units across the Air Force to figure out on any given mission where to kind of maneuver from an electromagnetic spectrum perspective.
Right. Yeah, sticking with space weather for just a moment and how it affects terrestrial operations, electromagnetic spectrum, et cetera. So, back in the 1800s, there was a famous thing called the Carrington Event. I'm sure it's something that y'all talk about in the schoolhouse a lot, or maybe operationally. But so if something like the Carrington Event happened today, would we see worldwide calamity or maybe isolated calamity? I guess. Well, first of all, could you describe what the Carrington Event was? And I guess the question I have is that are today's technologies better hardened against that kind of a calamity than the telephone wires were back in the 1850s or 70s? Could you take that in whatever direction you think is productive?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So quickly, the Carrington event happened. I don't even remember the actual dates of it, but it happened a while ago. And there was a fairly large coronal mass ejection where the sun spewed a whole bunch of protons and electrons and happened to be directed toward the Earth, and it entered Earth's atmosphere. Now, typically with our Van Allen belts and the radiation belts around the Earth, a lot of that gets trapped out in space and it kind of migrates toward the different poles. And that's clearly what causes a lot of the aurora borealis that you see up in the northern lights, up in the higher latitudes. When the coronal mass ejection is significant enough or large enough, that will track further south or toward the equator, if you will. And what ended up happening is in the northeastern United States, it happened to concentrate itself right on one of the power grids that we had and knocked out the eastern seaboard as far as power was concerned and knocked them out for quite a bit. It just, burnt out the electrical power grid there. Can it happen today? I would say yes. So while we as a world and as a nation tend to harden a lot of our stuff against different threats, we still have vulnerabilities. And so these protons and electrons that come out through the sun are at a molecular level. It's not at it's going to pass right through most material. And that's really what's happening. So we like to do a lot of wireless things today. That's going to get drowned out, obviously. If it comes to actual wired things, it's going to drown that out too. And so the space, things that we have in space, that will probably get burnt out. There's a lot of things on the ground that, even though we consider them hardened, may get burnt out as well. So unless they're really EMP or nuclear hardened, I would say that they're highly susceptible to another Carrington event. Lucky for us, the sun rotates an 11-year cycle. So unlike the Earth, which has a 1 year, you get 4 seasons in a year, 24 hours in a day, each planetary or each celestial body in space has a different time scale. The sun's time scale is 11 years. So every 11 years, you see a massive upheaval of the sun, and it actually flips poles. And that's what ends up happening every 11 years. And when it does that, it spews out a lot of stuff into the atmosphere or into space. And we happen to catch a lot of it just due to our rotation of the Earth. And so we're ramping up right now into a solar max event as we speak. So in the next 3 to 4 years, we should start to see an increase in solar activity. And so I would start to see an increase in disruptions to communications, disruptions to technology in general, those type of things. So it's going to ramp up, I think, and we're ready. We're rocking and rolling, and we're advising who we think we need to advise, at least at this point in time, and we're starting to posture so that we can work around it and make sure that at least our forces have the best possible advantage and create that asymmetric advantage that we would have over any adversaries so that we can keep rolling.
Right. So presumably wise organizations would be looking right now, or maybe they're already behind the 8 ball to harden themselves for increased solar activity over the next few years. And presumably it also provides you and your team opportunities for maneuver during these kinds of events as well. So maybe we can get back down to earth just a little bit more. So, weather in military operations has a long relationship. Do you have any favorite stories about how weather and military operations have come together in clever ways to, help one side or the other, or commanders have capitalized on what they knew about the weather and to their advantage? What are some, so I'm a retired Marine. We would call these sea stories. I don't know what you in the Air Force call them, but some kind of like meteorological war stories, I guess.
Yeah, sure. There's 2 that come to mind. The first one is D-Day, obviously. So during D-Day, that was a perfect example of how weather definitely drives behavior, and how having an asymmetric advantage, knowing what the weather is over your adversary, plays a huge role. So during D-Day, what the Allies decided to do was to start to, let me back up. In those days, we used to have airplanes that would go out and do weather recon flights. And the Allies would constantly send out recon flights over the Atlantic to see what kind of storms were coming their way up into the European theater. And alongside that, part of that process was to shoot down the Axis ability to do the same thing. And so they would deny the Germans the ability to do weather recon out in the Atlantic. And as a result, what we, the Allies, saw was that there was a small high pressure system that was going to enter the Atlantic, or that was going to enter the straits there between England and France and Germany. And so we saw a small window of opportunity that was going to come in, but otherwise it would have been totally socked in as we had originally thought it was going to be. Well, the Germans, who didn't have that same advantage, who did not have the ability to do weather recon, did not see that same small window. And as a result, high command sent everybody on leave. Most of the German command was gone that day. They were not expecting anything to happen between the 4th and the 8th of June, because they were all socked into weather. The seas were too high. They weren't expecting any sort of amphibious landing, so on and so forth. Well, we had a better weather forecasting capability, and that's the famous story that, General Eisenhower's weather forecaster came in and said, "Hey, boss, here's your window. It's on the 6th of June, and here's your small window of opportunity. This is the time to go." And so he launched on the weather guy's window, and then the rest, of course, is history from that piece. So that would be a good story.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
A bad story might be Operation Eagle Claw, which some folks may remember. It happened back in April of 1980, where we're trying to do hostage rescue out of Iran. And in that case, if you look at it from different perspectives, from a joint perspective, a helo perspective, aircraft perspective, everyone has a different perspective on that. But from a weather perspective, what went wrong there? So it was a complete dismal failure, and that was a huge lesson learned, because it was just an embarrassment. It was a failure. The whole thing, a lot of aircraft crashed. We lost a lot of airmen. We lost a lot of DoD personnel, service members. From a weather perspective, where I think we failed was that in that part of the world, the weather actually changes quite often. It's not always hot and sunny. And so the weather folks were brought in at the very last second, and they weren't told the bigger scheme of maneuver. They weren't told of the bigger plan. And so a pilot would walk in and say, "I need a weather forecast for this location to do this one small specific piece of the mission," that the weather guy had no idea was. So he gave him what he was asked for, and that was really it. Not knowing the rest of the story, not knowing what else was going on, he obviously didn't warn the pilot that there was other things that were going to happen. So as a result, they got sucked in. There was a sandstorm, and they all got lost, and everything that happened that went on over there, and we lost a lot of pilots. We lost an effort that day. It was really bad for the U.S. credibility in that case. Had the weather guys been brought in early on, just like they talked together early on and had everybody talk together, I think we would be able to avoid that disaster that happened. But that just goes to show that, from a weather perspective, it's not just tactical as everybody seems to think. Do I need my umbrella today or not? It's strategic as well. So everything from strategic through operational through tactical, weather definitely plays a role. And so the D-Day example would be a strategic example, and the Operation Eagle Claw would be a tactical example, both success and then subsequently a failure on how weather could be used successfully or more effectively during operations.
That's fascinating stuff. I was coincidentally talking with another Air Force meteorologist within the last couple of weeks, and I actually mentioned to him, like, "Hey, by the way, I'm going to be talking with one of your senior leaders here on the Cognitive Crucible podcast, Colonel Williams." He was like, "Oh, really?" I was like, "Anything I should ask him?" He said, "Yeah, get him to tell you the story about the first operational tornado forecast. You've got something in your schoolhouse that references this, like, you're about ready to set a precedent." He said it's a great story. Do you think you could give a beat on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So back around this week in 1948, so between March 20th and March 25th in 1948, over at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, on the 20th of March, they had a series of thunderstorms had rolled through, and some tornadoes came through, lots of damage and some fatalities that had come through. And the base commander, General Borum, I think it was, walked into his weather guy and said, "Hey, this was really, really bad. We need to do something about it." Now, you got to remember, back in 1948, we didn't forecast tornadoes because it was too short of an event. So tornadoes can pop up and dissipate within a half an hour. So within 30 minutes, it can pop up just like that and completely dissipate. And it's really, really hard to pick those things out. And so we never really forecasted for that. The science and the technology at the time was just not right, just not there. Even today, it's extremely difficult to forecast a tornado just due to the minute nature and the complexities involved with getting all the ingredients, so to speak, just right to pick out what a tornado is going to form and where and when and so on and so forth. And so why that particular event was so groundbreaking was that was the first operational tornado warning and forecast that had occurred since that time. And it was Captain Miller and Major Fallbush were the two weather officers on duty at Tinker Air Force Base. And as the story goes, General Barnum came in and said, hey, we can't let this happen again. And those guys put their heads together, did some comparison, and then some fast number crunching, which we use a huge supercomputer today to do. They did some quick number crunching and looked at a bunch of charts. And they said on the 25th of March at around 6 p.m., we're going to have tornadoes roll through. And so they got prepared and they issued the warning, and it actually happened just after 6 p.m. That afternoon or that evening, and tornadoes rolled through. No fatalities, a lot of damage, but because of their forecast, the base was ready. They had everybody on standby. The emergency crews were on standby. All the people were notified, and off they went. And so it was groundbreaking in that sense. It had never been done before, and it set a precedence now and an expectation that we need to go do more stuff. And so ever since then, we've been pressing. So that's what's so important about that specific one. And today, Fallbush and Miller are still revered heroes, so to speak, within the weather community because they started that precedent. And so their groundbreaking work that they did, we continue to try to emulate as we go forward.
Yeah, no, that is that's cool stuff. And right there at the end, when you're talking about setting a precedent, it's like, so I work in data science and analytics, and I'm seeing just like a little touch point here. It's like once you do something well, the expectation becomes that you're going to continue to do that, but not only continue to do it, but then start doing it better. And so in the world of analytics, it's like whenever I develop something, cool or interesting, or, tries to answer a question, it's an inherently frustrating endeavor in that whoever is receiving the information is like, oh, wow, awesome. That's great. But it would be really great if it could do this. And so you're always kind of like reaching for, better. And so in that way, it's kind of like an inherently frustrating endeavor quickly on the heels of success.
So it's funny you mentioned that because that's how we got started in 16th Air Force. It was a quick, can you do this? And we did. Well, can you do this? And we did. And it just started snowballing, no pun intended, into something bigger and bigger and bigger to now our mission set now is, predict and influence behavior. And so that's where we really started to kind of gain our fame, so to speak. The easiest way to kind of do an analogy is we all know about hurricanes, when they hit the East Coast. And so as a meteorologist, we can look at a hurricane, we partner with the National Hurricane Center, and, we can tell you, the strength, the intensity, the direction, the speed, all that of a hurricane. We can even tell you where landfall is going to make, where we're going to make landfall and when, basically. And that's all well and good. And that's kind of what you expect out of a weather dude. But where we really make our buck is we can also tell you what military installations are in the way or in the path. And from an Air Force perspective, what assets are on those installations? What assets have to move because we know that they can't hangar them or whatever, and when they have to move them by because there's a crosswind component, so aircraft can't take off if the crosswind component's too high. And then where are they going to go to? Because not every aircraft can land at every air station. They have to have some place for them to bunker down. They have to have some place for them to get logistics. So there's a lot of complexity that goes along with that. And so when you look at all those parts and pieces, we can forecast every bit of that, and that's a behavior. We can forecast that behavior. And if we're going to be nefarious, we can say, well, when are we the most vulnerable? We're the most vulnerable when we are having to be forced to move. Fair? And so weather doesn't change, the laws of physics doesn't change with political boundaries. So I can apply that exact same mindset to an adversary, China, Russia, Iran, whatever, whomever. It doesn't really matter whoever. And we can apply the exact same mindset and thought process to someplace else. And we can predict, based on weather patterns, based on whatever's going on, what we think the adversary might do as a result, and then take that and figure out what are some courses of action that we could take as a result of that. Now, in its very nature, information warfare is non-kinetic. So how do we impose a cost on the adversary? And imposing a cost could be lots of different things, right? If we look at it, cost could be a missed opportunity, increased fuel. I forced you to move when you didn't want to move. I forced you to make a decision you didn't want to make. I caused confusion. I forced you to look left versus looking right. Whatever that case is, that's a cost. That's a cost in an adversary that they otherwise would not have had or have to now deal with, that they really wouldn't have wanted to deal with. And by its very nature, if we look at the definitions, imposing a cost on someone is an offensive act. And so if we look at it from that lens, weather now can be offensive. Now, how many people would have thought of offensive weather, an offensive weather capability? So that's kind of when we look at Fallbush and Miller's, precedent setting, that's what we're trying to do here at the wing, is set some new precedents and look at this from a completely different lens and say, what is in the realm of possible? What can we actually do? And so is offensive weather capability out of the question? Absolutely not. Can we do it? Absolutely. And so how do we think about that? What does that look like in the future? And how do we employ it effectively? That's where we come into play. And those are some of the discussions we're looking at having right now with senior leadership.
That's fascinating stuff. And so I would also drop into all of that discussion maneuver warfare and using weather as a maneuver element in a tactical or operational campaign. Is that a common expression amongst your colleagues?
It is actually. So we look at, from an Army perspective, ground scheme maneuver, from a sea perspective, from a Navy perspective, sea scheme maneuver, air scheme maneuver, the whole things. When we look at weather, again, we focus all over the place, right? But when we talk about the Army as an example, so that's the closest I can do for the Marines, because the Marine Corps has their own weather capability. And I know a lot of those guys, and they're phenomenal Marines, and they're very, very smart, and they're brilliant dudes, and they're really, really, really awesome. I had the privilege when I was on the Joint Staff to converse with a lot of those guys and just kind of see what they do, and those guys are really, really cool. So they're focusing more on the Marine Corps piece, the littorals aspect of it, and how to do those things. When we talk about landscape maneuver, we talk mostly about the Army piece and how are they going to transverse, from point A to point B, to get the logistics where they need to go, and so on and so forth. A great example, and you see it in the news already today, we saw some footage of Russian tanks stuck in the mud, right? And so my analogy to that is, when weather was at its fullest or its best, you don't see U.S. tanks stuck in any mud, regardless of where we are or when we are, right? That doesn't happen to us because we have that superior weather capability, so to speak. And now I'm sounding kind of narcissistic, but it is what it is. That's where the asymmetric advantage starts to come back into play, and that's where we look at it from that perspective. We work with civil engineering a lot, especially with the Army. If we have a lot of rainfall, we work with civil engineering. Is the ground saturated? Can it hold it? Can it absorb it? Or are the riverbanks going to overflow? What about the bridge? Are we going to knock out bridges as an example? Here at Offutt, we had a historical flood a couple of years ago, and it was somewhat predictable because we saw, the levees were getting overflowing, and what does that look like? And how do we predict those type of things? And when we talk about logistics, militaries don't move without logistics. Beans, bullets, and beds. You need all of those things, and fuel to keep armies and militaries running. So we provide direct support to Transcom as well, and they're a global capability. Nobody goes anywhere without gas. No one goes over there without beans and bullets. So whether it's shipping it by sea, shipping it by air, shipping it by land, Transcom is there, right? And so we're there every step of the way with them, and we provide that weather capability that they need so they can maneuver and forecast and figure out what's the best avenue of approach to get to where they need to go. We do volcanic ash as an example. We forecast volcanic ash and what that's going to the impacts of volcanic ash on air flights, as an example.
Yeah.
So, and what people say, well, it's just volcanic ash, just go around it. Well, yes, you go around it, but what does that mean? That means instead of taking two sorties with, the back full of cargo, now I may need to take 4 sorties, which means some other operation is minus 2 sorties. And so that creates a backlog. That means I have to take on more gas. More gas means less cargo, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole logistics calculation that goes along with that.
It's all about making better decisions. So even with like ships on the ocean, presumably there are thresholds. Some storms might be inconsequential and you can just plow ahead without significant loss of efficiency, but there must be decision making around that, where now that this storm is of a sufficient size where it would make more sense from like a whole cost perspective to divert around the storm. And you and your team help provide that kind of decision input.
Yeah, absolutely. So that one actually traces back. There's another story back to World War II. It's actually a Navy story where an entire carrier strike group was lost due to a hurricane. And so the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, which is out in Hawaii, was stood up specifically to avoid that from happening again. And it's a combination between the Navy and the Air Force working together to look at the Pacific area, the entire Pacific zone, so that the U.S. forces don't get surprised by some sort of typhoon in that area, protect U.S. assets. So that entire joint unit, which the 527th is a part of, at the 17th Operational Weather Squadron out of Hawaii, partners with the Navy at the Joint Typhoon Warning Center for that specific reason, so that doesn't occur.
So obviously this is an unclassified setting, but what really cool new technology are you and your colleagues working on or aware of that you could share with the audience? Like, for example, like I think that this is old technology, but back in the Vietnam timeframe, we were working on ways to like seed clouds so that it would rain or snow or not rain or snow or something like that. Yeah, what kind of cool stuff is happening in the world of weather that would kind of like drop into this conversation?
Yeah, sure. And I could talk about weather modification if you'd like, but
Sure.
We've migrated away from that. And we can talk about that as well. But some of the cool things that we're doing right now is how do we use information and the digits that we have, and then couple that with AI to create something that's usable to create an outcome on the back end. So right now, some of the big things that we're working on is global synthetic weather radar. So as you know, radar, we have Doppler systems, which sends a signal out and it gets that return signal, and whatever's in between, it gives us a different frequency, and that's how we could determine distance, speed, and also the things that are going through the atmosphere. Well, I need a radar to actually send a signal out to do that. So some of the cool things that they're working on right now is how do I create a synthetic radar image that's based off of satellite imagery, as an example. And then based on what I see on satellites, how do I get a composite radar image that might be comparable? And then we can use AI to kind of figure that out. So with different observations that we have on the ground, satellite information, whatever, how do I create a radar image? Because radar gives us a lot of different information that other capabilities just doesn't give us. And so how do I do that? So they're developing that right now. We're operationally testing some of the output that they have at some of our squadrons right now to say, hey, yeah, that's working, that's not working, or it's kind of missing it here, it's kind of missing it there. And we're using AI in that regard to get after that. So in today's 21st century, that's kind of really where we're kind of focusing our attention. In the past, we focused on weather manipulation, weather modification. And China today is actually doing that. I think it was in the news not even a year ago, where to have a nice day out in one of their cities, they seeded the clouds to have it rain out so that the fog was dispersed and so all that smog and everything was gone. So they had a nice, full, clean day so they can have the cameras rolling for that day. So weather modification is still practiced today, but we, as the US DoD, were working on that back in the 70s and the 80s, and we ended up banning it by the 90s for a myriad of different reasons. And we were looking at all sorts of stuff from converting solar energy to absorb and heat things up, as you can imagine, how we have solar panels for today, to heat in the atmosphere, to alternating the air motion, so have the air go in a different direction, which has its own consequences, increasing or decreasing humidity in the air to either make it rain or make it more dry, and then just seeding clouds and those type of things. What we found is some of the best use cases were for fog. So some of the airfields were always socked in fog, and so we want to get airlines or jets to land, and it was always socked in fog. So they tried these mechanisms to either increase the moisture in the air and have the fog rain out, so to speak, because fog in general terms is really a cloud on the ground, basically. And so if you can get it to rain out, it dissipates the cloud. That's one way of doing it. And so they try to, increase moisture into that zone and just have it rain itself out so they can get a plane to land when it needed to land. They tried all kinds of other things, and it was successful at first, but it had other complications on the back end. One, they can only replicate it on certain days and certain times. And then two, by having that increased moisture, what they found is the runoff was going to somebody else's land, and now there was some legal disputes. So then when you're talking about Mother Nature, so now legal gets involved. And so, it gets really complicated really, really fast. And so they started abandoning those scenarios. Up in Alaska, they tried different other parts and pieces where it was a reverse process. They tried to heat up the atmosphere. Similar effect, but then they had other complications downrange or downwind, as we call it. And then it became a legal dispute there as well. And so, farmers do it a lot. They'll seed the atmosphere a little bit.
Is that right?
And you have environmental groups that they get involved. Say, okay, what are you doing to the atmosphere? Are you harming things? And so there's studies, this, that, and the other. And so it's like, okay, at the end of the day, it was too much consternation to continue. I could say it that way, I guess.
Yeah.
And so it was like, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze.
Yeah.
And so now we're looking at it from a different perspective. How do we take AI data and then manipulate the data and use the data in a different mechanism, use the data in different ways to create a different output, and then couple that with operations, couple that with intel, couple that with cyber, couple that with how we're getting after the problem set, and generate a new outcome on the back end. And then what is that new outcome? And does that new outcome give the DoD an asymmetric advantage that we can take advantage of? And if the answer is yes, then let's pursue that. And so that's how we've been kind of getting after it.
Yeah, you're describing the weather manipulation. It's just a whack-a-mole problem, and presumably, however clouds get seeded, maybe that changes the pH or the content of the water that comes out of the cloud in ways that over time has some kind of an effect that neighbors and communities don't appreciate. So interesting stuff. I'd like to start wrapping up, Pat, if I may. So talent comes up frequently on this podcast as a major issue for our national security. How do you think about talent and the various different competing demands between government talent needs, private industry, et cetera, and how it plays a role in this competition that we're in?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It's a really good question. So as you can imagine, across the DoD and across all the different services, no one has enough. If we all had enough, there would be a need for commanders, I guess. So as we go through, I talk to a lot of other weather units, and we all have a shortfall, and we just don't have enough talent to go around. It takes a lot to grow a forecaster. For example, to be an officer, an Air Force weather officer, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, you have to have a bachelor's degree in meteorology. And that's a hard and fast requirement. And it's really, really hard. And so even on the enlisted side, you have to score pretty high in the ASVAB scores. And we send you through a lot of schooling, almost a full year and a half of schooling just to become a forecaster. That's a lot of training, a lot of training just to get these airmen on board, just to be what we call 3-level, just enough to do some basic forecasting, because so much rides on that forecast. And so the training pipeline is long, and it's really, really hard. And so what we get on the back end is a highly qualified forecaster that can do great things for the Air Force or the DoD for that matter. And then when we look across the board and say, hey, As an airman, you're going to get paid so much, but if you go in the civil sector, you can get paid 5 times that amount for doing almost less work, really. And so retaining talent is a hard thing. How we retain talent right now is purpose. They see the bigger picture, they see what it's there for, and all of our airmen are patriots, and God bless them all. I mean, airmen, Marines, and sailors that are METOC, that are meteorology and oceanography focused, they could all be making so much on the outside, but they stay because of that higher purpose. And so, talk about being patriots and true Americans. There's not a better group I'd rather work for. And so if we could have more, that'd be great, but yet we're competing, of course, with the civil sector. And then we're also evolving, because the meteorology of yesterday and the meteorology of today are different. And so you mentioned it earlier, we need those data managers, we need those cyber specialists, we need those information operations kind of folks to kind of think through the data differently. How do I pick out useful meteorological information and apply it to an outcome? And I can't just have a strictly a forecaster or a meteorological person. I have to have somebody who can think outside of that box. So all the training that we provide to that single individual, I have to give them more just to keep up with today's technology. And so it gets even tougher at that point to maintain that type of credentials, certifications, and just to retain the talent. And then recruiting that talent, because we have a large civilian population, but how do you compete, right? How do I compete with a tech company that's going to offer the same individuals, hundreds of $1,000s a year, and the government doesn't pay that much? We all know the government doesn't pay well. That's not why we wear the uniform. It's not for the pay, for sure. But we have to appeal to their sense of patriotism, basically, and that greater purpose that they're contributing to. We do a fairly good job at it, but we still have shortfalls that we need to really get after. So talent is definitely hard to deal with, and retaining that talent is also really, really tough to deal with.
Yeah, no doubt. Could we wrap up, Pat? Do you have a book that you could recommend to our audience if they want some kind of a deeper dive or an interesting dive into some weather-related materials, or anything that might, you think, be of interest to this audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I finished a book not too long ago called The Little Ice Age by Brian Fagan, and it's how climate made history from 1300 to 1850. And the thing about that is Brian is not a meteorologist, he's a historian. And he uses history to talk about climate, how the climate actually changed over time, because the climate does change. How climate changes and how fast it changes and what causes climate change is a matter of political debate, it would seem, but the climate does change. And it's been changing and evolving over time for quite a while. And what he does through this historical look of the Little Ice Age, he talks about shipping, he talks about fishing, he talks about how we went from Europe to the US, what we know as today as the US, and how shipping lanes have changed, how shipbuilding has changed, how farming has changed and why it changed, and then the good and the bad and techniques that evolved due to climate change. And it wasn't all negative, it was vastly positive as a result of that. So I thought that was a very interesting forensics look at climate and how weather drives behavior, and which is our theme, which is our motto here at the Wing, is weather drove behavior in that book. And he took a historical perspective of how that whole thing actually went through. A couple of other books I thought was really interesting was one's called Agent of Influence by Jason Hansen. He's a CIA agent or an ex-CIA agent. He talks about how to influence people. He tries it, the way he put it was, as a CIA officer, he's trying to influence somebody to commit treason, which is the hardest thing to ever to do, right? And so if you can apply those same techniques to entrepreneurship, you should be able to do that, right? And so I like to read those type of books, because as we're in the military, I have to convince you to spend money on my program, perhaps over somebody else's program, because it's always a fight for a rice bowl. It's always a fight for some funding, right? So how do I influence you? And then I also looked at it from the other perspective of, if I know more about the weather than you do, how can I influence you? And so that's really my job. So I look at it from that perspective. I thought that book was pretty interesting, the way he wrote it. And then the last book I would recommend is called Disinformation by Lieutenant General Ion Pacepa, P-A-C-E-P-A. He's a Romanian Secret Service Soviet bloc defector. And he wrote about how disinformation, how the Russians use disinformation, and it's fascinating how they influenced U.S. Climate, social climate back, in the Clinton era, all the way to today. And so, and this was all Russian influence. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, but just the techniques they used and how they used what we consider today social media, how they used radio and television and newspapers and that soft gray zone power, which is really all about information warfare and how do we do that today. And so I thought there were a lot of lessons learned out of all three of those books that I would use here at this wing and I would use in general for information warfare that I thought were very, very interesting. And as we look at information professionals across the board, those would be three books that I would recommend. Because everyone would read those books and pull different lessons learned out of them that they can use for their own sector of the DoD that they're contributing to.
Wow, those are some outstanding suggestions, Pat. Really appreciate it. And as you're talking, I just looked up that General Ion Pakepa. Just passed away in February of 2021 at the age of 92. Soviet defector. Who worked with the CIA after he defected. So yeah, great suggestions, all of them. And you've given us a lot to think about. Really appreciate it. And with that, Colonel Pat Williams, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.